Hi, seventh graders. Today we are going to read our third story of from our storytellers who are again, remember, on our way to Canterbury. So as they continue on their journey to Canterbury for their pilgrimage, they continue with their storytelling. So we're going to skip a few chapters and we are going to get into our next story. Our next story is the Partner's Tale. And as you can see on my screen, we're going to talk a little bit about what a partner is. So we need a little bit of background information before you're going to understand what I'm exactly going to read. And today I'm also going to model for you how you should be reading and thinking with some inferences and some predictions and some questions after you read. How that really helps you understand exactly what you've read. Okay. So as you can see on the screen today, we are gonna the story that today we're gonna talk about illness, death, and religion in the Middle Ages. Based on what you know so far about from reading the Castle Diaries and what we know so far about life in the Middle Ages, what is illness and death like, and how does religion play in that role? Okay. There's a lot of references to illness and death in the Castle Diaries, which we read last week. And there's so far of the two stories we've read, The Knight's Tale and The Miller's Tale, we've also heard more about illness and death. Um, and just some background information: poor medical condition, diseases, infant mortality. Death was a pretty common part of life in for people who lived during this time. They didn't have modern medicine, they didn't have immunizations, they didn't have hospital and doctors who were well trained and treated in the areas to be able to help people. Fear of death, religion. Um, After death, religion played a very big part in societal roles at this time, and death was something that people were fearful of. And the tie into religion with the fear of going to hell. And I'm using that word not as a profanity, but an actual place. So people didn't want that to happen to them. They knew that they could die at any time. And so they were motivated to go to church and be religious and ask forgiveness and pay for their forgiveness for their sins that they had committed in life. Moving on to our next slide. So as we read through it, we're going to give some just a little background information. If you ask, what does it mean to pardon somebody? You've done this multiple times. You've bumped into somebody. Oh, pardon me. Excuse me. So what does that mean? Medieval pardoners were people who were authorized by the church to sell pardons that would forgive or excuse people for their sins. Pardoners would take money from people and they give people relics. And a relic was a piece of artifact of something that was said to be important religious. Um, Most of the time, they were fake. You're going to hear that in the story. Physical remains of actual saints or people who had died, or pieces of a church or a cross or something that's important. These are called relics. The church would then, this is one way the church raised money. People would go and they'd confess their sins, and then the partner would say, okay, to be forgiven for your sins, you'd have to pay this sum of money. When you pay this sum of money, you often got a relic that you would put in a special spot in your house, and that would be a symbol that you had money to be able to pay for your forgiveness of sins. And at this time, people believed they could buy their way into heaven, even though no matter what sin they had committed. Now, um, so the partner's job was to make money for the church, and they would hear people's sins and they would say, okay, this is going to cost you a certain amount of money. If you can pay this, great. You're going to be all good with God. You're going to be able to go to heaven. Now, think to yourselves, what people could afford to pay the partner's fee? Certainly not the people on the bottom of that hierarchy. The people on the top, yep, but the people on the bottom, not so much. Okay. So a partner is a person whose job it is their job is to raise money for the church, and they work for the church. Okay, you need to understand that. Moving on to slide number 10. I'm going to start reading, and as you've already picked up, most of the introductions for the next person telling the story come at the end of the previous person's storytelling. So we're going to start on page 59. That's where you're going to pick up your book right now, and you're going to follow along with me. Okay, we're going to read the first part. When the partner had been sent packing by the formidable widow, he turned his attention to the knight. Sir, I can see you're a God-fearing man as ever set knee to a church floor. Here you are riding to Canterbury in the hope of a blessing, and here I am with a pack full of holy objects, all honeyed over with blessings for any man who touches them. Give me a crown. Crown was a type of money, currency. And I will let you see the headcloth of the Virgin Mary herself. And I'll throw in a glimpse of Saint Sebastian's thigh bone preserved in alcohol. Now, as I read that, I'm going to tell you what should you be thinking about when the partner had been sent packing. As you read that or listened to that and read that with Mrs. Harper just now, you're going to notice that the partner's offering the knight, our loyal friend, the knight, our chivalrous knight, to a chance to pay his money to see a relic from the Holy Virgin Mary, okay, and a thigh bone from Saint Sebastian. So he's right away offering his wares and saying, "Pay me money, and I'll let you touch this or see this or hold this, and it'll be worth your time and effort." Turning to the next page. Our knight's response. "Thank you, sir," said the knight, who was always polite, even to fools. "But last year I stood in Jerusalem itself and saw the garden where our Lord Jesus was laid, and where he rose to life again. I saw the fields where the blessed George's cross flamed in the sky before the Crusaders' victory over the infidel. I don't know but that your veil and thigh bone would be a disappointment after that." So in this paragraph, the knight responds. He does not like the partner. It's obvious. But when our author uses the words, he says the knight was polite even to fools. So it's kind of like a little play that he's basically thinking he's a fool, the partner is, but he's still maintaining his dignity, maintaining his chivalrous code of being ethical and moral. And he doesn't call the partner out, but he basically says, "Look, I've been to all these religious sites, and anything that you have in your backpack or your bag of wares probably would fail in comparison to that, would pale into comparison to that." Okay? So we're going to keep reading. The sea captain was much less polite. "When I was sailing at Juhau on the Red Sea, I sank a ship carrying 200 holy grails, a flock of sheep's bones that each one bottled and labeled with a different saint's name, and enough splinters from the cross to build Noah's Ark all over again. And for Our Lady's headcloth, that's all supposing she just dressed like the widow over here, I've seen enough to make sails for the English fleet." Okay? So that paragraph shows us that the sea captain is basically saying, "Look, I saw a ship sunk with all your partner's wares in it, all of your supplies in it, and there were so many things, and they're all just replicas, and they're all just common items claiming to be from these holy things and these holy people. But in fact, they were just modern things, but labeled differently." So the sea captain, unlike the knight, he's kind of mean about it. And he says, you're just telling me a story, and it's what you're telling me doesn't make sense, and it isn't true because I have my proof from when I saw sunken ships. I know what you have in that bag, and it's not real, and it's not anything from the church or from God himself. It's a common item claimed to be holy. We keep reading. "Are you calling my friend a liar?" roared the summoner, pushing his pustule nose in. The captain reeled in the smell of new garlic, but he was unabashed. "Yes, I am calling him a liar and a charlatan." "Oh, well, that's all right then," said the summoner, burst into a cacophonous laugh. The doctor took a look at St. Sebastian's thigh bone and said it was a pig's trotter. "Ah, well, I bought it in good faith," bleated the partner, "and those of you who scoff at us officers of the church will all burn in hell." After we read that chapter, it's pretty obvious the summoner is another religious man who the author does not show in a good light. So the way the summoner steps in and says, "Oh, no, listen to what the partner has. He's telling the truth." He's kind of with him. He's with the partner. They have a scam going together. One person says one thing and the other person backs it up. And the way that Chaucer chooses to describe him, he is he stinks like garlic and has a pustule snout, a nose covered with pus. You, and he basically is calling him out and saying he's lying. Okay. And then when he gets called out and said, when the sea captain calls him out and says he's lying, the summoner steps up and said, I know that he's telling the truth. And if you don't believe him, you're all going to go to hell. And so when he says that, people get scared because, again, remember, they know death could be happen to them at any point in time, and um, they don't want to die without having a chance at redemption to be able to go to heaven. And that's really important to them. Continuing on, last paragraph. This threat, even coming from a straggled hair booby, silenced everyone. The partner looked round in triumph and, seeing the chance to drum up a little custom, told us a story about his favorite subject, death. Now, this paragraph that I just read to you at the end of page 60, who is giving this information? This threat coming from this. So whose response is this? This is our narrator. And our narrator, again, is Geoffrey Chaucer. So remember, Geoffrey's also on this trip, and he's recording all of these stories that these pilgrims are telling. And so he steps in and says, all right, yeah, he's a booby. He's straggly hair, means his hair is untidy, dirty, limp. He's unattractive. He describes him as that. So just his word choice that Geoffrey Chaucer uses in this example shows us that he doesn't think too highly of the partner. Okay, so now we are going to begin the partner's tale, Death's Murderers. Prepare yourself for another famous Mrs. Harper read aloud. If you have your book, you're following along with me, please. I am on page 61 in our story. The man Grab was slumped over the table at the Tabard Inn in Southwark. You may know this place. We know this place because this is where our story started. He had wetted his brain in beer, and it weighed heavy. The clanging of the church bells registered dully in his ears. Who are they burying? He asked. Old Harry, the landlord, who was wiping tables close by, said, Don't you know? I wondered why you weren't at the funeral, him being a friend of yours. It's Collie the Fence. Caught in it last Wednesday and gone today. Him and his wife and his two boys. Caught what? Demanded Graham, grasping Harry's arm. Well, the Black Death, of course. Then another customer chimed in. Aye, they do say the plague came to the Cobbleton town over yonder, and death laid hands on every man, woman, and child and carried them off. Where? Carried them off where? Demanded Graham, fighting his way through drink haze like a ghost through cobwebs. Who knows where death carries men off to, said the deeply hooded character sitting in the corner of the bar. But he sure enough comes from every man in the end, and he's taken twice his share recently, thanks to the plague. Tears of indignation started in Grab's eyes. I don't see why death gives the right to go carrying off anyone, he sluttered. And if you ask me, it's about time some brave soul stood up to death and put an end to his carrying on. His carrying off, I mean. Dip, cut, where are you? And he stumbled off into the sunlight to look for his two closest friends. Dip was at home in bed, but not for long. Grab knocked him up and called him out into the street. They met with Cut, coming home from a card game and cursing his empty pockets. Grab threw an arm over each friend's shoulder. Have you heard? Old Collie the Fence is dead. Death carried him off and all his family in a couple of days. Let's take it old, friends, not to rest until we tracked this death fellow and stuck a knife between his ribs. That's what the mayor and parish would pay if we brought. Think what the mayor and parish would pay if we brought Death's body back. Besides, how many purses do you think he's emptied on the dark highway, eh? Death must have made himself quite a wallet full by now. Cut fingered his sharp penknife, the one used for cutting purses. Dip felt his fingers itch with the promise of rich pickings. We're with you, neighbor Grab, they cried, and off they reeled, not the sum total of one brain between the three of them. They looked for Death in the graveyard, but decided he must be out hunting the living instead. They looked for Death in the fields, but he had always gone before they arrived, leaving the flowers doomed to wither and the leaves sooner or later to fall. Then, as the daylight failed, they saw a small figure on the road ahead. "We've caught up to him!" cried Graham, and they fell on the man with flailing fists. "Wait a minute, this isn't death at all," said Cut, leaving his penknife fall. Letting his penknife fall. "He's just some silly old duffer. Look at him. He's older than Musayathus." The old man peered at them from out of the dark recesses of his hood. His face was as white and bony as a skull, with purse-string lips and eyes sunk deep in red whorls of wrinkled skin. His hands were as brown as vinegar paper, and his back hunched over like a turtle shell. "What do you want with me? Don't I have enough to put up with? Can't you leave a poor, blighted old creature in peace?" "You're no good to us," Dip said in disgust. "We wanted death, not some wrinkled old prune on legs." A bitter laugh creaked out through the creature's gaping ribs. "You want death? Oh, not half as much as I do. I'm the one poor beast alive that death can't carry off. I'm condemned to live forever and to creep about the earth in this worn out old body, getting older and older and older. As for death, I just left him under that oak tree yonder. If you hurry, you'll find him still there." Cut's knife was raised again. "So, you've had dealings with him. We'll kill you anyway." The fossil of a man let go a sigh that seemed to break through his brittle skin. "I wish you could rob me of this tedious bird in life. You should pity me, even if you have no respect for my old age. But don't bother to batter on this prison my soul calls a body. You can't free me from it." He shuffled out from under their raised blades, muttering, "You're the lucky one. You might die today." "Get to bed with the maggots and mold, you old relic of the devil," Grab cursed. "We're on our way to kill death. Then no one will have to die anymore." As soon as the old man was out of sight, the three accomplices forgot him completely. Under the oak tree, there was no sign of death, but there was a pot of gold as big as any crock of gold at the rainbow's edge. Cut tipped the jar over with his foot, and the wealth of 7 lifetimes spilled out onto the grass. They looked around. No one was even in sight, and there had been no attempt to hide the gold. It lay there, just inviting them to keep it. Grab and Dip and Cut were suddenly rich. "Rich, we're rich, 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 rich," as the gold coins spilled out of the jar. So all thought of their plot to kill Death dropped out of their minds. "Dip, your legs are youngest," said Grab. "Run into town and fetch us some wine. We've got to celebrate luck like this." "Why is it always me?" Dip threw a sulky look at the gold, but was given only one coin to buy the makings of a party. "We'll both stay and guard it. Don't you worry," Grab assured him. "Be quick, lad. When you get back, we'll decide what we're to do with it, what mansions we'll build, and who to bribe, and what monks we'll pay to have done in. We don't have to do our own dirty work. From now on, boy, we'll be the three kings of the thieves." Full of such thoughts, Dip set off into the dusk to buy cakes and wine. The sun was behind him, and his shadow stretched long and spidery ahead, so that he was all the time stepping into his own darkness. Grab and Cut watched him go, and then sat down on either side of the pot of gold. They counted the coins. Somehow it always came out to a different number: 848, or 916, or 772. Grab scowled. "Of course you realize we can't divide it 3 ways." "We can't?" "You take my word for it. It won't share out evenly." "It won't?" "2 ways, yes, not 3. One of us will have to take less." "Oh." Cut decided at once that since Dip was the youngest, he should take the smallest share. They both nodded to themselves and settled back to counting the gold. This time there seemed to be 999, or 783, or perhaps 870, but it did not change their opinion that Dip should have less. "Of course, it won't go far between the 3 of us," Grab mused, "not with the cost of living how it is, and you know how Dip squanders money." "No. He'll soon have spent all his, and then he'll be asking to borrow from us." "No, but I can't spare any of mine," said Cut anxiously. "No more can I. There's little left to share out between 2, let alone 3." They laughed. into silence, and above them the oak's heavy branches groaned while the gold coins clinked between their fingers. Supposing, said Cut, just supposing Dip was to meet with an accident on his way back from town. So many thieves these days, said Grab, nodding sadly. So many ruffians and murderers. Meanwhile, Dip was watching his shadow move ahead of him on the roadway like a black plow. How big it was, much bigger than him. When he had his share of the money, he would be a much bigger man in every way. No more creeping through the crowds at fairs, cutting purses and catching the pennies that drop. He could walk tall and stately in fur-trimmed robes, and people would touch their forelocks and step aside. Beggars would fight for the chance to plead with him. And if he felt like it, he could drive them away with a pelting of money and see them grovel in his wake. But if he was going to start giving money away, there must be less for his true necessities: drink and women and gambling. In fact, he could think of so many good uses for the gold that it seemed a pity that Cut and Grab had been with him when he had found the jar. Really, the more he thought about it, the less fair it seemed that they had bunked in on his good fortune. As he reached the outskirts of town, he noticed an apothecary's sign hanging over a door. He did not remember ever seeing it before, but he knocked without hesitation. "What's your trouble, young man, that you rouse me from my bed?" An ancient, hairless head poked out of the upstairs window, grotesque and vaguely familiar with its parchment yellow skin. "Rats," said Dip, his head muffled up in his cloak. "The rats are eating me out of house and home." "Here, one drop of this will finish them off. Have it for free." The ancient apothecary must have had the poison in his pocket, for he dropped it down at once into Dip's outstretched hands. "It couldn't be simpler," he called as the boy hurried off to the inn. Dip bought three bottles of wine. Every last drop of the poison went into two of the bottles. The third he marked carefully to be sure to tell it apart. Then he was off to collect his rightful share of the gold hoard, every last coin of it. In the pitch dark of late evening, he stumbled over Cut and Grab, snoozing under the oak tree in the deep grass. "You've forgotten us," said Grab with a sort of a grin. "I wouldn't forget my two old friends, now would I?" Dip opened his bottle of wine and took a swig. "Have a drink, why don't you?" Cut and Grab knelt up and groped for the wines, their hands brushing Dip's face in the dark. They moved to either side of their good friend. Along the road came the sudden noise of the plague cart rattling out of the town towards the lime pits and Ring-a-Rosy Hollow. They all three watched its creaking progress beneath the light of the coachman's torches. Its white cargo of dead bodies joggled against one another like restless sleepers. A limp arm dangled through the cart rails, swinging to and fro, for all the world as if it was beckoning to them. "We took an oath to kill Old Death," said Cut, remembering. "We'll get round to it sometime," said Grab, drawing his dagger. "One thing at a time." He plunged the knife into the back of Dip's neck. It met with the seam of his hood, and the lad looked round in astonishment in time to make out the shape of Cut outlined against the moon. Then Cut's sharp penknife caught him under the ribs, and he sprawled cursing to his death among the gnarled roots of the oak tree. "It's done," Grab panted, and his throat felt suddenly dry. "Let's drink to our partnership, Cut. Where did he put those bottles?" By feeling along the ground, they found the three bottles in the long grass. They opened one, had emptied itself into the ground, but the other two were intact. A bottle apiece. Cut and Grab sat with their backs on the oak tree and drank to their new-found fortune. In the morning, Death came back for his pot of gold. He wrapped it up in the miserable rags of his decaying cloak, closed it into his gapy ribs. The three corpses under the tree made no move to stop him, and he left them to the wealth of flies and crows before continuing his endless journey. The gold waited late in his arms. Though his bones were dry and his muscles were like the withered tendrils of a grapeless vine, his strength was immense. He could carry off the biggest or the strongest of men, even though, like any man or beast, he could never carry off himself. Remember, said the partner, intoning through his nose in his best Sunday bleat, death is only the crossroads at which we take the road up to heaven or down to hell. He accompanied this with sawing movements of his hand with the sticky white palms, and surrounded by his bottled and bagged relics, he put me in a mind of conjurer performing tricks. Conjurer performing tricks. By the time the partner had finished his macabre story, large numbers of pilgrims had dropped back to the ride in the bunch at the rear. Comforting drink was circulating, and the cook was already flat on his back with his head lolling at the roots of his horse's tail. God's good mercy on us, miserable sinners! He cheered, and as the haberdasher tried to pour wine into his mouth, choked and fell off. By Saint Lloyd, what a nasty story, said Priorless Elgentine. My little wolf did not like that one bit. Her lapdog accordingly growled at the partner from the pommel of the nun's saddle. But the summoner took great delight in his friend's story and burst into song. Sleep, little my lovely, and wake with a smile. Death is forever, life's only a while. The partner joined in, and his blonde lashes straining like exclamation marks round his bulging big eyes. Death is forever, life's only a while. Angrily, the miller drowned them out with a frenzied lament on the bagpipes, and the sea captain could be seen on the skyline, keeping his distance until the subject of death had been well and truly dropped. I noticed, remember, I in our story is Geoffrey Chaucer, the author. I noticed during the course of the afternoon that certain numbers of the pilgrims slipped furtive coins into the partner's hands and were allowed to peep into his baggage or touch one of his worthless fakes. I suppose that's how he carries on in his little country churches each Sunday, scaring the congregation witless with talk of death and hell, and then letting them buy back their peace of mind with their hard-earned pennies. Myself, I wish you could get nearer to heaven by touching a bottle full of pickled pigs' trotters, feet, or half an old pillowcase. The partner and their summoner, their arms round each other's shoulders, rolled along like two pirate ships lashed together in pitched battle. They roared songs together in each other's ears like volleys of cannon fire, singing whenever the miller played on his bagpipes, the summoner pausing only to cram garlic cloves on them. The magistrate, perched forward like a parrot on a perch, trotted up to Harry with a fiercely efficient look on his face. Dinner? Bed? He snapped. Any ideas? Horses. Getting tired. I was thinking to stay the night at the Sacran's Head, said Harry affably. We'll be there in half an hour. The magistrate altered the length of his stirrups, then busily altered them back again. Must be properly organized. Some very sloppy fellows here. The fat cook? I'd throw him in the ghoul. It's all in hand, said Harry. Before we get there, Geoffrey here can tell us the story. Right, good. It's in hand then. Well, organize it myself. Lots to do, lot on my mind. Yes, all right then. And he bustled away to do something very important, or at least to think about doing it. I expect something good from you, Geoffrey, said my old friend. The ship's captain, tossed painfully about in the saddle, asked what work I did to make myself good at storytelling. I'm a customs officer, really, I said, and a poet, in a small way. By Saint Elmo! Exclaimed the captain. A scribbling custom officer! I fought pirates and thrown them in the sharks afterwards, but the only sharks that ever robbed me were your accused revenue men. Well, I'll scuttle not you now that we're on dry land, my boyo. You could tell of the 1,001 tales of the Arabian Nights, and you wouldn't get my vote. I knew now that I had to think of something a little special to entertain my fellow travelers. I won't give you a story at all, I exclaimed. I will give you an epic poem in 107 verses, a little thing I composed last week. So Geoffrey is Mr. Chaucer, our storyteller, who's on the trip with all the rest of the pilgrims, um, he is basically said that he's somebody who writes taxes for people, and you know about taxes now. Taxes are something we pay for services, and taxes are painful. It takes money away, but it takes money away to do things like schools and roads and healthcare, things that they didn't have at that point. So tax collectors were seen as bad people at the time. And so when Geoffrey confesses to the sea captain that he used to collect taxes, the sea captain's not too happy to hear that. So that was kind of explaining that exchange. Hope you enjoyed the story.